The Russians surrounded the Ukrainians in the rubble of the houses, their rifles firing, tearing pieces from the buildings. The men trapped inside watched anxiously as the enemies were getting closer and support was not arriving. A Russian finally prepared a rocket-propelled grenade and aimed it at the hideout. In another location, the Russian trench was attacked by enemy drones. The men ran, abandoning their posts, and their escape allowed the Ukrainian Marines to enter the trench. A tank moved alone across the fields, feeling the artillery fire licking its armor as it headed for a heroic battle against a village held by the enemy. By the second month of the Russian offensive in Kharkiv in 2024, some of the crucial fighting took place in the small village of Rybolk. The Russian President Vladimir Putin declared on June 14, 2024 that the goal of the new offensive in Kharkiv was to create a demilitarized security zone on the border to prevent Ukraine from continuing its incursions into Belgorod. He had already mentioned this before, stating that this zone needed to be established at a safe distance from Russian territory to prevent long-range weapons, especially those of foreign manufacture used by the Ukrainian authorities, from being able to reach peaceful cities. Thus, starting from Belgorod on May 10th, Russian troops crossed the border and devastated much of the Ukrainian defenses in that oblast. There had already been several Su-34s bombing Ukrainian cities for months, being a constant source of problems for Ukraine. Until that moment, no foreign weapon had been officially used in Belgorod. It was precisely the invasion of Kharkiv that triggered the release, so that the high-mobility artillery rocket system and other weapons could start bombing the Russians in the region. In summary, from May 10 to 12, Russian forces launched a significant offensive in the Kharkiv region with up to 5 infantry battalions. The invaders crossed the border, capturing several villages and forcing the evacuation of residents. There were reports of disruption in Ukrainian military communications due to the loss of Starlink devices. More than 30,000 Russian soldiers were involved in advances in areas such as Vovchansk and toward the city of Kharkiv. By May 13, Ukrainian forces managed to partially repel the Russian advance, destroying 20 units of armored equipment. However, the situation remained tense, with fighting in several villages and reports that the Russians controlled parts of Morokovet, Olenikov, and Ohitsev. On May 17, the Russian president stated that the goal was to create a buffer zone to protect the border areas. No plans to capture the city of Kharkiv. Between May 18 and 26, the fighting continued intensely, with advances and retreats on both sides. Ukraine managed to regain some positions and inflict heavy casualties on the Russians. Until May 31, the fighting continued, with limited Russian advances and Ukrainian forces managing to repel several attacks. The situation in Kharkiv remained volatile and difficult, but under control. In June, Russian troops were stuck in Lipsy and Vovchansk, fighting in the villages around the cities or inside them. At several points, the Russians began to lose territory. The situation was increasingly tense, and Ukraine's strong response did not prove to be a significant victory. The village of Rybolk had just over 1,200 inhabitants. It was simply a settlement in northern Kharkiv, too close to the Russian border to be considered safe. Russian forces arrived in the region on May 15, claiming they had taken control of Staritsia, Rybolk, and Lukyanets. The Ukrainians attempted a counterattack, sending in an assault group which was met with heavy fire. The explosions forced the armored vehicle off the road and into the line of fire, leaving the Kiev soldiers at the mercy of the artillery. In that war, the drones wouldn't let the artillery steal the spotlight. They showed up for kamikaze attacks that scattered bodies everywhere. The drones were operating in the Ukrainian trenches. Some time ago, flights were almost unrestricted toward the holes used in the defense of Kharkiv. The reconnaissance lenses witnessed the explosive impacts. The men tried to escape from the smoke-covered areas, groaning with shrapnel in their bodies. It was no use trying to hide among the trees. With the equipment, the lenses captured the worried soldiers and alerted the kamikaze swarm. The men who left the trench to rest had the unpleasant visit of drones in their houses. The buildings collapsed on their heads, and their vehicles were also destroyed, reducing the possibility of evacuation. Russia formed the Sever, or North Troop Group, which is responsible for the region along the northeastern border with Ukraine. The group was commanded by Colonel General Alexander Lapin, who also led the recently re-established Leningrad military district. There was no shortage of criticism for this commander. Lapin held the record for lost equipment. He lost more than 75 pieces of equipment during the crossing of the Severskidinets River at the beginning of the 2022 invasion. At the time, Ukrainian forces destroyed the river bridges, delaying the Russian crossing. Lapin tried a new strategy to move his vehicles across the water and continue the advance. Some Russian BTRs were spotted before that, being targeted by artillery. Men in the trenches fired RPGs successively at the Russian troops, further delaying the slow advance of the adversaries. The forces on the hills fired everything they had at the armored vehicles, which dared to try to carry out the orders to advance. At the end of the battle, at the Severskidinets River, the Russian forces of the 74th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade belonging to the 41st Combined Arms Army were defeated by the tanks of the 30th Mechanized Brigade and the artillery of the 17th Tank Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. After the Second Battle of Lyman in 2022, in which Ukraine emerged victorious, Ramzan Kadyrov, head of the Chechen Republic, severely criticized Alexander Lapin. Kadyrov held Lapin responsible for the withdrawal of Russian forces, stating that he would demote him to the rank of private, strip him of his medals, and send him to the front line barefoot, armed only with a light machine gun, to wash away his shame with blood. Maybe he paid with blood, maybe he didn't. But in May 2022, a rumor emerged that the 10th to Dogma circle is only the Arum. 2 years earlier, the Russian offensive in Kharkiv in early 2024 seemed promising for Lapin. The Russian troops advanced quickly in Rybolk, living in Nitvy, which their collaborative record with ATN foresaw for the Japanese. The turn-scarers, according to the Lance drones, taking advantage of the favorable summer winds, flew over the trees, hunting and destroying enemy armored vehicles. The Russian artillery in turn demonstrated great precision by bombarding the Ukrainian equipment surrounding Rybolk. The Ukrainians were indeed surrounding the village. Their shots began to fall all over the territory, searching for the Russians to tear their skins apart. The houses were shattered by gunfire, reducing the protection of the Kremlin's troops. The 92nd Assault Brigade defended Kharkiv at the beginning of the 2022 invasion and during the counter-offensive that retook the territories that year. Now, the BTR-48 from the 92nd was firing its 30mm cannon in yet another counter-offensive. That was an amphibious infantry fighting vehicle with 8x8 wheels designed in Ukraine. The shots exploded in the houses. The light of destruction flashed dozens of times as the Russians tried to protect themselves from that advance. The violent passage of the armored vehicle reminded the invaders that they were facing a new phase of the fighting. The Kremlin's soldiers couldn't stop the equipment at that moment. Later, a Lancet found it, bringing the Russians revenge, hitting the armored vehicle with fire, which completely cooked the BTR. The aerial bombs further disturbed the bucolic landscape of the city, which would be a dream vacation or retirement spot for many people. The calm was replaced by successive explosions in the main houses. Ukrainian armored vehicles acted against enemy trenches, putting pressure on men who began to realize that holding Lviv would not be easy. How do you take the M113? An American armored personnel carrier drove through the area, feeling Russian fire scrape its armor and shake the men inside. The soldiers were placed in new defensive positions. The armored vehicle continued on its way, plagued by enemy bombs. Its passes through the trenches brought even more fire down on the Russians, shaking the men. So that the Ukrainians could enter and retake the area, this offensive began to put the Ukrainians inside Rybolk. Again, they ran to the houses. Each soldier was aware that he could have been seen. Their arrival was not stealthy, nor was the visit from the enemy artillery shell. It was, for the explosive came in a violent visit upon the house. The Ukrainian soldiers still alive were fired upon by Russian infantry rifles. The Kremlin forces crawled around Rybolk, took positions to shoot at the Ukrainians who were cornered inside the rubble. The squad exchanged fire with the Kiev soldiers inside, until one of the Russians drew his and fired at the most exposed opponent. The place filled with smoke, the Russians stood around trying to sense the smell of death. Amid the acrid smell of the explosion, the smoke slowly dissipated and the Russians kept moving at the same pace toward the enemies. The shots kept coming from inside, which made the closest man move in to try to throw a grenade. The explosion had little effect happening outside and other grenades flew in, but they only added more confusion and smoke to the chaos. The Russians had to be careful with these prolonged attacks. It wasn't just their drones watching Rybolk. It was no longer their exclusive domain, neither on the ground nor in the air. The kamikaze drones took advantage of the men's focused gaze against the Ukrainian soldiers, diving into the middle of the squads, shattering bones and the fragile strategies of close combat. The Russians tried to hide among the houses, but the drones saw everything that happened in the small village. There were explosions for everyone, and they spread through all the small houses and streets where the Kremlin's troops were. What were once assault squads became men on the run looking for shelter, often without a chance to communicate with their comrades. Rybolk became a hunting ground for Ukrainian drones, letting the pests fly after the Russians. When any movement was noticed, one of them, who thought he was safe to try to escape, had a grenade land right in front of his feet. Fallen, he was gifted with another explosive between his legs, which started to be licked by flames. Without help, the man agonized until only his bones and the horrible smell of burning flesh remained. It wasn't always possible to wait for help from friends. An explosion knocked down 3 Russians. Other soldiers showed up, but there were only words of encouragement until 2 of them got up and left on their own. One was still there, stunned and with smoke lingering on his body. Another soldier appeared beside him. While he was groaning, he started to take off his gear and threw it on the ground to heal himself. The fallen man watched him leave and closed his eyes in despair. The smoke on his back turned into fire, touching the stored ammunition, and the explosion ended his agony. Some, badly wounded and well aware that no rescue was coming, just looked at the rifles on the ground and tried to roll over. To make a final choice, the few houses still intact might seem like a good option for protection and a dream of a few minutes of comfort. In war, everything turned into a nightmare. When the kamikaze drone arrived, hungry for Russian flesh, the survivors tried to hide in other ways, taking advantage of the camouflage of the dense vegetation. Then the drone came to end another life. When the drone batteries were recharging, the Ukrainian Mikoyan Gurevich 29S returned to find the village. They dropped arc bombs. The Russians were watched by reconnaissance as they proceeded to hide in a house on the outskirts of the city. Before they started another assault, the Mikoyan Gurevich, 29, which had been present for a month, sent a message to the soldiers. A quarter-ton warhead exploded over the house, and other bombs kept falling from house to house, finishing the transformation of the landscape into an apocalypse. The plane was shot down. The Russians continued to drop bombs on the Ukrainians. The fighting in Rybolk was far from over until mid-June. The Ukrainians had taken several positions, but the front line was stalled without significant advances from either side. Kiev troops with a D-20 howitzer were found. It was a towed artillery piece with a 152mm cannon manufactured in the Soviet Union and loaded manually. It was blown up. Even hidden among the trees, the Russians targeted the Ukrainian artillery pieces to prevent them from harassing their soldiers inside the village. These explosions succeeded in keeping the Ukrainian advance stalled, while more soldiers moved in from the north to take positions around Rybolk. The Air Force bombs came from Belgorod, falling with force inside the village. The place was less than 60 kilometers from the border, giving Russian planes an easy opportunity to drop whatever they wanted. The Ukrainian defenses were not yet active to shoot down the aircraft or hit their airfields. The nearest bases of Kiev's forces were hit. Everything was shattered, which left the soldiers with only the need to look for another place and bury the dead. What? Men were taking advantage of the new ammunition supplies released in those months to fire their mortars at the Russians. But they gave the enemy an opportunity. By doing so, Lapin's troops put an end to that happiness. After discovering the hideout, they waited for the men to come out to fire their shots. The artillery ended the reaction of Kiev's soldiers. The way the war was going, whatever the Russians took, the Ukrainians tried to take back. Shortly after, the drones dropped grenades on well-structured defenses and the Russians ran to escape the aerial threat. The abandonment of their posts cleared the way for the Ukrainians of the 36th Marine Brigade to begin their advances. They entered the trenches, already knowing that there was a Russian hiding in the first bunker. The men proceeded carefully, trying not to be caught off guard by an enemy appearance. They threw the fragmentation grenade into the dark hideout. That wasn't enough. Depending on how the Russian was inside, the fragments might not hit him, or the force of the grenade might not affect him. The shots provided more suppression until the rest of the Ukrainians arrived. They gathered in front of the smoky exit, firing more rounds at the hidden enemy. Only after they felt safe did they entered with their rifles aiming and shooting. To finish off the bunker, the Russians lost that position but advanced with their tanks inside the T-90A. The crew members passed along the road. With so many remains of their own and Ukrainian equipment, they were worth more than a lifetime of those men's salaries. They tried not to think about it when the planes unleashed fury against Kiev's defense posts. Especially because in war, life is often cheaper than a piece of metal. The explosions ruined the trench defenses, sending men running to avoid being torn apart by the tank, which moved skillfully across the field. Without a drone to intercept it, it gained confidence in its attacks. In early July, the Russians sent an armored column the size of a platoon against Rybolk. It was the first attack of that intensity there since mid-May. A large part of the group ended up suffering from the enemy's aggression while still trying to reach the village. The Achilles tank platoon of the 92nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, Antiga Kunitsky, Alliance, Gridas, Illumin, Duorog, the Battle, the Individual, repelled the enemy attack with drones and bombs. At the end of the battle, all 4 enemy tanks lay destroyed, marking a decisive victory for the Ukrainian forces. It took a lot of courage to make those advances in open field. The tank from the 92nd Ukrainian Brigade had to do the same alone to attack the Russians in Rybolk. The crew prepared for the attack, which would take place at night, to intensify the Russians' nightmares. His drone accompanied him, as did Russian eyes. Inside the armored vehicle, the Ukrainians were sweating nervously, knowing that the protection around them could easily be destroyed by drones and bombs. The latter rained down, releasing their thermobaric power on the ground. It was the Russian TOS-1 lighting up the night just before dawn, making it look like small suns were forming on the ground. The tank's cannon gained strength in the darkness, generating light in the field and in the city where its shells exploded. The Russians' hideouts burned, with the attacks, and first-person view drone dove onto the armored vehicle, heating up the armor even more. The tank persisted. Its insolent shots struck the Russian positions. More shots crossed the field. The tank showed how the monster slithered during the attacks. At dawn, it was gone, stained by enemy fire, but leaving behind a village full of flames where corpses were consumed. In early June 2024, Rybolk was still a contested region. The Russian advance remained stalled. What was supposed to be a buffer zone only served to accumulate bodies from both sides and did not prevent the Ukrainians from fighting. They continued launching their attacks against Belgorod. General Lapin had a problem on his hands: how to break through those defenses in what had previously been an easy advance. Russian power was stagnant, and he became a victim of the mockery of the spirits of war, laughing in his dreams at all his plans and making him relive each one of them with his eyes closed, only to turn them into nightmares. When he woke up to the news of the day, it wasn't over. The horror continued. Volchansk region, there was a lot happening again at the front.